Right. Just waiting for the to be.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, I apologise for the unexpected break. We are now proceeding with the agenda. We're starting on item 14 on page 11. First of all, I will ask the officer to introduce the report, and then we will get on to the other stages of the decision. Are you doing this, Richard? Mr. Timms.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. So this application, just to get your bearings, the site is just to the northeast of Staplehurst, just here. Moving into the site location plan, which you can probably just make out, outlined in red. The site consists of grazing land, laid to pasture, and it's immediately east of Staplehurst with an area of about 6.6 hectares. The settlement boundary, current settlement boundary of the village, runs along the edge of the site here. The site's divided by a number of hedges and tree lines. There's also a number of ponds within the site. Got a number of houses and the railway line to the north here. And there's also a housing application which is on the same agenda from Redrow for 185 houses, and that adjoins the site to the east here. We've got Headcorn Road to the south and another application on tonight's agenda, Stanley Farm to the south. The eastern edge of the site here doesn't actually follow any physical boundary on the ground. It just divides existing fields based on land ownership. As I said, the site's in the countryside, being outside the current settlement boundary, but it has no special landscape designation. I'll quickly run through the photographs. This is looking at the site on the right here, where the access will be approximately there from Headcorn Road. This is further along Headcorn Road, heading back towards the village, and the site's within here. That's the front there. Now moving into the site, this is the frontage, where the access will go in here, and Headcorn Road's along that line. Similar position, just looking west back towards the village. Headcorn Road's along there. Now in the southern part of the site, that's the west boundary along there, and this is the southern boundary. Again, there's the west boundary, the properties in Hurst Close and the estate that's there. On the right here is the western boundary, and you can just see houses at the southern end. This is from a similar position looking east, and the Redrow site is roughly beyond that hedge. This is at the northern end, so you can see the edge of the current settlement on the left there, and the northern end of the site. This is just moving further up, so that's the northern edge. Fishers Road is going down here. And this is lastly on the eastern boundary, so the Redrow site is to the left, looking back down towards Headcorn Road. So the application is a detailed proposal for 167 houses, single vehicular access at the south here onto Headcorn Road. And it will have pedestrian and cycle links to Fishers Close here and onto Fishers Road at the top. There'll be a main, as you can see, the main central spine road with secondary roads leading off and some smaller cul-de-sacs. The layout is landscape and ecology led in that it's keeping and retaining and strengthening the hedges and tree lines that exist, and then focusing on ponds with open space. Houses of a traditional design, detached, semi-detached and terrace houses, all of 2 stories, and there'll be one apartment block in the centre of 3 stories. Affordable housing is proposed at 40%, that'll be 66 houses. And it's felt that there's good connectivity to the neighbouring proposal. Won't go into too much detail, obviously we're considering that later, but this plan is just to illustrate how we feel the sites connect with one another, with the open space areas here, pedestrian cycle links, so that's just to illustrate that connectivity. Quickly on to the main issues. In terms of policy, the site's obviously beyond the settlement boundary in the local plan from 2000, but the council's current evidence need for housing means that the settlement boundaries will have to change to meet this housing need. The site is allocated for housing in the new submitted local plan in order to meet this housing need. And on this basis, the weight afforded to policy ENV 28 as a policy to prohibit further development is much reduced. The Council can also demonstrate a 5-year supply in part based on the allocation of such sites in the local plan. The site is also allocated within the neighbourhood plan for housing development, which attracts significant weight, and that will be going to referendum next week. So essentially, non-compliance with ENB 28 must be considered in the context of the site's inclusion in the local plan and the neighbourhood plan, and therefore, in our view, should be accorded limited weight. And we feel that the policy principle is acceptable. Visually, there would be some harm to the landscape, but this is considered to be low and localised. The design is considered to be a high quality and a high quality layout. In terms of highways, the access and transport impacts of the development on its own are considered to be acceptable. The cumulative impact of traffic on the crossroads with the other sites in the local plan and being considered tonight has been assessed, and mitigation is proposed to ensure traffic levels and congestion would be acceptable. This includes financial contributions to public transport, including to improve this train station, increase bus services to half-hourly, travel plans to decrease traffic, and physical works to the crossroads itself, which are considered to be safe. In terms of ecology, great crested newts and reptiles are on the sites, but the ponds and corridors would be retained, and there's no objections from County Council Ecology. The site's not in a high-risk flood zone, and sustainable urban drainage is proposed, which is considered acceptable, and foul drainage would be dealt with by condition. There'd be contributions towards infrastructure, including education, youth services, libraries, healthcare, and open space would be provided with off-site contributions. So in conclusion, the proposal would provide much-needed housing at a suitable location allocated in the emerging borough and neighbourhood plans. The harm caused to the landscape is low, and any residual effects of the development are considered that can be mitigated. And for the reasons outlined in detail in the report, the application is recommended for permission. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Timms. Right, I'm going to ask our legal officer to just outline how the public speaking component of this evening will work. Please, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is a short announcement for members of the public, and in particular those who are speaking on any item this evening. As you've just heard, an item is announced by the Chairman, and then the Planning Officer introduces the item. The Chairman will then call the speakers. When you hear your name called, please can you come forward to the table in front of you and take a seat. To speak, press the middle button. You do not need to hold it down. The button will turn green, and the ring around the mouthpiece on the microphone will turn red. You will have 3 minutes to speak. Ordinarily, I'd say you'd see the time counting down on the screens behind me, but they're not working tonight, so I'll be doing it on my mobile phone, and hopefully will not ring during the course of this conversation, but I will let you know when your 3 minutes is up. Once you've finished speaking, please press the middle button. It'll turn white and then return back to your seat. You may hear some of the speakers this evening referred to as visiting members. They are members of the Council, but they do not sit on this committee. They also have 3 minutes to speak, but they have no right to vote on any of the applications. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fitzpatrick. I am led to understand that our first speaker listed this evening, Mr. Claridge, is unable to attend. So we will proceed to Councillor Burnham of Staplehurst Parish Council. You have 3 minutes, sir.
Okay, thank you, Chair, Councillors. Staplehurst Parish Council acknowledges that this application forms part of a site allocated for housing in the emerging local plan, and therefore in the Staplehurst neighbourhood plan, but there was an expectation that there would be a master plan for the whole site, which hasn't been forthcoming. The neighbourhood plan promotes good connections to integrate new housing and an end to cul-de-sac estates, and we think this site must connect by road with the Redrow housing site to the east. The policy H150 of the submitted local plan states that open space should be sited to maximise accessibility to new and existing residents. Apparently this site will include a locally equipped area for play. We'd like to see details of this and of its future management, as it should provide a facility both for the future residents of Fisher's Farm and for children from the existing housing areas to the west. Possible improvements at Jubilee Field, which is more than 600 metres away along a busy road, shouldn't be a substitute for an on-site children's play area. The Parish Council's comments on this highlighted concerns about the pond in Hurst Close adjoining the site, and that doesn't seem to be dealt with. The improvements at the station haven't been presented in detail, and we would hope that any improvement should be aligned with the proposals of the neighbourhood plan for this area. The speed of traffic on Headcorn Road regularly exceeds 30 miles an hour, going past the access to the site, which is on a blind bend. We also note that no plans have been put forward to improve the routes eastward from the site, and the wider road network also has to be taken into account. And finally, the proposed mitigation scheme for the A229 crossroads, removing the pedestrian crossing at the Headcorn Road High Street junction, is opposed by most people in Staplehurst. We question whether the changes proposed would improve traffic flow significantly, but they would certainly make this now attractive area both unsafe and inconvenient for pedestrians, wheelchair users, bus passengers and cyclists. And this would work against the objective of reducing dependence on the private car, and installing railings on the east side of High Street, as proposed, would be difficult because of restrictive covenants on the land and the many underground services. We think this application is not good enough. Staplehurst deserves high quality and well thought out development as outlined throughout our neighbourhood plan, and we ask you to support Staplehurst Parish Council and refuse this application until these important issues have been resolved. Thank you.
It was bound to happen, wasn't it? Thank you, Councillor Burnham, for a constructive speech. Mr Dale for the applicant, please. Mr Dale, you have 3 minutes, sir.
Good evening, Chairman, members, officers. My name is John Dale. I am the design manager at Bovis Homes Easton. I'm also a registered architect by profession. Pre-application consultations for the development at Staplehurst have taken place between Bovis Homes and Maidstone Borough Council. In addition, a public exhibition was held at the Village Centre, Staplehurst, during July 2013. After the exhibition, an application was made for 168 dwellings in August 2013, which was later withdrawn. And a new application for 167 dwellings was submitted in November 2014. It is this application which is being presented tonight to committee members. The principal difference with the current application being that there is only one main vehicular access off Headcorn Road. There have been ecological enhancements. Cycle access is now from Fisher Road and Hurst Close. There's now provision for wheelchair-compliant dwellings within the scheme, and there's the incorporation of a leap. Since the submission back in 2014, numerous meetings and negotiations have taken place between planning officers, as well as feedback from consultees, including Design South East. As a result, the design has developed and fine-tuned to where we are now. This has been a very inclusive and productive process for all parties. The layout is very much landscape and ecology-based. The scheme uses good urban design principles to provide a safe and pleasant environment in which to live, creating interesting, recognisable spaces within the public realm to give the residents and visitors to the site a sense of place. In addition, with the use of good architectural detailing and quality materials, will provide an enhanced and attractive scheme to this edge of Staplehurst. The development will provide a mix of house types and sizes, from one-bed apartments through to 5-bed detached houses, catering for a very wide range of household requirements. Of the 167 dwellings, 66 are affordable, of which 60% are rented and 40% intermediate. We are disappointed at the time that it has taken KCC Highways to resolve matters relating to the junction with Station Road. In our experience, similar situations were deemed acceptable. We had hoped that Highways would have reconsidered their pedantic approach in order to achieve the necessary benefits to operational capacity and to support delivery of housing. It is worth pointing out that there is a full suite of measures, including contributions towards the bus service, allowing increase in frequency, improvements to Staplehurst railway station, a travel plan for all...
I'm sorry, sir, that's 3 minutes. That's 3 minutes. Councillor Bryce, you reserved your right. Do you wish to...
Thank you, Chair, members, officers and members of the public. As the Ward Councillor for Staplehurst, I want to share with you my grave concerns regarding the Crossroads Mitigation Plan for Staplehurst, which forms part of this application. The existing crossing is the main crossing route used by residents, including our school children and disabled residents. It's the main walking route from the west side of the village to the east where the school is. As part of the local plan and the ITS, the Council committed to looking at this junction to improve it. This design does not conform to that remit. Removing this crossing is an unsafe plan. Why is it required? Well, it has to be removed as the pavement on the east side is being removed to create an extra lane. Where it creates a third lane, inevitably cars will have to weave in and out of the cars sitting in the middle lane to turn right into Headcorn Road. The visibility will be poor for cars seeking to do the opposite manoeuvre, turning into Marden Road from Station Road, and accidents are inevitable. This is not an improvement. It is a fudge to get figures down to the bare minimum. Figures do not include the traffic movements for the Sainsbury's site, which Sainsbury's have confirmed in September to us that they intend to proceed with. Figures do not include the potential increase in traffic by commuters when money from these sites is invested in our popular railway station. You may look at these plans and say, well, it's okay, the crossing is proposed to be resited. However, it's being resited to a location only 100 feet from a blind bend. Our Speedwatch team regularly records speeds in excess of 40 to 50 miles per hour at this site. The stopping distance for 40 to 50 miles per hour is 118 to 175 miles per hour in good conditions, with optimum thinking distance and road conditions. These do not all apply here. There is a camber in the road on the bend that regularly floods. It is inevitable if we site the crossing here, drivers will not see pedestrians until it is too late. We will see accidents. It also has an impact on disabled residents. Disabled residents won't be able to get their wheelchairs through the narrow passageway to the Chestnut Avenue pavement, which is intended to replace the pavement that's being removed. Therefore, they will no longer be able to access the northeastern side of our village, which includes a new specially designed open space at Oliver Road, which has been designed specifically to have wheelchair access, and they won't be able to access the railway station. The second part of the Crossroads mitigation plan is to address safety concerns over people using the existing crossing by installing high railings. This will ruin one of the iconic images of Staplehurst, that of our chestnut trees on the green by the crossroads. This should be a heritage asset, celebrated and protected. This locality is of significant value. The impact on this site is not low. This is where our war memorial is sited on the Marden Road corner, and there are many listed buildings surrounding this area. It will also make it dangerous for cyclists, with the likelihood that heavy goods vehicles turning left into Marden Road will trap them against the railings. KCC and planning officers have spent well over a year looking at every possible scenario. If there were a better solution, we would have found it. I've attended many meetings, and the different ideas people have raised have been investigated, but all have had significant obstacles. Further, these applications don't deliver enough for infrastructure. Our primary school is to receive no investment, and the improvements of the railway station will benefit commuters from outside the village, not the commuting population of Staplehurst, who access the station perfectly adequately on foot. Members, please look at the safety aspects of these plans. We know you do have to determine the applications in front of...
Time, Councillor, I'm afraid. I have to say, Councillor Bryce, that it is a unique talent to be able to speak so quickly and still remain intelligible. Congratulations. Right. Are there any members wishing to speak on this application at this point? No. Well, in that case, I'll take Mr. Wright from Highways if he has any comment to make.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, the key issue of the crossroads, this is a signal-controlled junction that is on a key primary route within the highway network, the A229. And it's a very constrained location, and there is limited scope within the existing highway boundary to create additional highway capacity. It's already operating at a level approaching capacity, and it already operates with mover software, which enables the signals to be reactive to the prevailing conditions and essentially optimize the amount of traffic that can pass through the junction. So with that context in mind, the cumulative effects of the development plan for Staplehurst pushes the level of operation to a level that is above practical capacity. And I use the phrase practical capacity because I'm conscious of the tables that are in your papers this evening, which obviously cover a number of different scenarios, but I think that when viewing those tables, the key to bear in mind is that the practical capacity of a signalised junction is at 90%. It's not at 100%, it's at 90%. And that's because the modelling software that is used to test the operating conditions makes an allowance because conditions at a junction are not going to be static within any hour. They're going to vary during that hour. There are going to be fluctuations in traffic conditions. The modelling makes an allowance for that. Therefore, the practical capacity is set at 90%. So I would just ask that members bear that in mind. Now, there have been a number of iterations in trying to identify a scheme to improve the junction and mitigate the cumulative impact of the planned development. What has become very much apparent is that in trying to increase the physical capacity, compromises have to be made in terms of the facilities that are available for pedestrians, the convenience that's afforded to pedestrians, and most importantly of all, overall levels of highway safety. Now, as is standard practice for any proposed modification to the highway network, we requested that a safety audit was undertaken on the proposed junction improvement. And this raised two very specific issues that unfortunately have not been resolved. And perhaps if I quote directly from the audit itself, the first of those issues was relating to the removal of the pedestrian crossing on the High Street arm of the junction. The audit highlighted that as an issue in that removing the crossing is likely to result in a desire line that is uncontrolled. So pedestrians will still seek to cross there even if you remove the crossing. It is a desire line. Now, guard railing was put forward as a potential solution to address that problem, and that was again put back to the safety auditor who'd made this recommendation in the first place. And the auditor said that pedestrians will continue to use, desire lines are not always sated by the provision of guard railing, and it is still likely that pedestrians will still attempt to cross where there is no such provision, i.e. on the southern side of the junction at the termination of the guard railing. So as far as the Highway Authority is concerned, that remains a recommendation that has not been adequately addressed. If I could just turn to the other outstanding issue on the safety audit. And this is associated with the removal of the footway on the northbound side of the High Street. The auditor highlighted issue that removal of the existing footway may result in pedestrian slips, trips and falls, given that in the absence of the footway, pedestrians would be using the grassed verge area. And the recommendation was made that a new footway is provided, essentially replacing the one that is being taken away. Now, that's not something that the applicants are able to provide, given that it falls on land outside of the highway boundary. And contention was made that the parallel route on Chestnut Avenue could instead be used. But the auditor, when that view was put to him, expressed the opinion that pedestrians will continue to use the most direct route adjacent to the carriageway in the grassed verge on the western side of the High Street. So again, I would say this is a recommendation that's come from the safety audit that has not, unfortunately, been able to be addressed. And these are matters of highway safety, and the Highway Authority has therefore been left in the position where we have had to raise objections simply because adequate mitigation has not been put forward, and we are concerned that there are highway safety implications associated with the proposed junction improvement. Thank you.
Right, before we proceed any further, I would like to direct members' attention to the fact there are 2 urgent updates on the papers amending conditions. So I draw your attention to these at this point. I will ask officers to respond immediately to those points, and then I will bring in the members who have indicated. Might be useful if you are able to point out, insofar as you are able to, any responses you have to the points, very cogent points that the Parish Council made on detailed issues, if you are able to at this point.
Clive, if I could bring in the Highways Officer from MOTS, first of all to answer some of the questions, and then I'll bring in the Case Officer for the application to answer some matters in terms of the footways that we need to have a response back. So if I could start with Transport Officer first, please.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. I just wanted to take Mr. Wright's point about practical capacity of 90% in the first instance. Now, that is the desirable capacity threshold, which you would design for when planning signalised junctions within new developments or improvements to junctions in rural areas, because that threshold gives you some leeway for flow variability within the period that the model tests. However, it's very common that for networks in built-up areas which already experience a degree of congestion, achieving a 90% performance is often unachievable, and we need to look at theoretical capacity as the key threshold, i.e. 100%. And I would refer you to Table 1 in the report, which demonstrates, even without the, first of all, Table 1, even without the mitigation proposed, that only one arm, Headcorn Road, exceeds that theoretical capacity threshold with all development traffic and with the comprehensive travel plans, and then only in the PM peak. So we would consider that level of operation to be acceptable given the nature of the existing conditions in the area, the constraints we have due to existing properties and the third-party land. And it's something, and that threshold has been considered acceptable on many, many occasions in considering applications for sites elsewhere in the borough. In terms of the points of the safety audit that Mr. Wright raises, he mentions about the guardrail. And the guardrail, I accept that as the guardrail may have been presented in certain drawings, the length shown would, where it's curtailed, there is still a chance that uncontrolled pedestrian crossing movements to follow the desire line could happen. But it would be possible to extend the guardrail further south for a distance towards the bus stop to an extent which would control those uncontrolled movements, and allied to the proposed pedestrian crossing would result in a level of diversion to use the formal crossing rather than crossing in an uncontrolled way, which would be very moderate. And we believe that would mitigate the risk of uncontrolled movements significantly. In terms of the removal of the footway on the west side of the High Street arm, he mentions about the safety auditor mentioning about people would continue to use the verge as a desire line with the consequent risk of slips, trips and falls. But I would maintain that there is a parallel route using hard standing on Chestnut Avenue. It is a very, very moderate diversion using existing footway infrastructure that's in place now. And I consider that would be a minor inconvenience to pedestrians to use, as opposed to a verge, which, particularly in inclement weather, would be a much more unattractive option in my view.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, just to add on that last point, the slipping and tripping was raised in the safety audit. It is disappointing that that's been raised at the committee meeting, because in discussions with Kent Highways, that hasn't been raised as an issue in the final conclusions, which were just solely on the guardrail and the congestion. So that is disappointing that's being raised at this stage. Just moving on to the parish council points, forgive me if I have missed some, but I've got, in terms of master planning, unfortunately, the sites are in different land ownership. We have no control over that, but what we've sought to do through pre-application and during the applications is to ensure that they connect appropriately. And I think, although that's probably not that clear, that plan is to try and illustrate how we have got them to connect. The similar issues that we haven't, because they're in different ownership, we haven't been able to ensure that there is only one access. In terms of Hurst Close, and I think this relates to the pond that's there, there is a condition on the permission to ensure boundary treatments around ponds on the sites for safety reasons. And in terms of the train station improvements, there are some details on that in the report. We have involved the parish council to a degree to seek their views, and quite happy to involve them in the future in discussions with Network Rail on that. Thank you.
I think members may be returning to some of those latter points in due course. Now I'll try and decipher my notes, because I've got two MBs. It's funny how you always come in at the same time. Councillor Matthew Borton first, I think.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And before I comment on the specifics of the application, I'd just like to make 3 points which I think are relevant to this, very much so, because we just heard them, and also to other applications that we have here. Firstly, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, but I'm going back to my usual gripe about the length of urgent updates here, because we are here to make proper and informed decisions on behalf of the residents of Staplehurst and the wider borough. So to turn up with pages and pages on all applications of unseen updates does not allow us as committee members, I don't feel, to make the best informed decision. I've raised this before at this committee with officers. I'd be very grateful if this could be taken away and actually addressed, because I see no evidence of that happening so far. So that's my first little gripe. My second little gripe, again, something that I've mentioned before, is the usual Kent County Council v Maidstone Borough Council dispute that seems to take place, which I feel, and certainly residents say to me in my ward, and I'm sure they say elsewhere as well, there's absolutely nothing to inspire residents' confidence in either authority whatsoever. So I'd like to put that on record that the two councils need to get their heads together and do more rather than battling it out in front of us here, because again, it does not lead to the best and to the informed decisions. And the third point I'd raise as well is it was mentioned with regards to the degree of saturation on some of the junctions discussed. and reference was made to other sites elsewhere in the borough. Now, yes, there is very severe traffic problems, not just in Staplehurst, but at Hermitage Lane on the Sutton Road before. We are always told on this committee that we have to judge each application on its merits. And so I don't feel it's appropriate to go, oh yes, actually, well, it might be worse elsewhere or it might be better elsewhere. I don't think that's appropriate. I think we are here to judge this application as we see best fit in front of us, and we should do so irrespective of whether there's congestion on Hermitage Lane or not, because that is not a consideration for what we have in front of us here. Turning to the details of the application itself, Staplehurst is obviously a linear village. It's got the A229 running through, and the crossroads are always going to be a bit of a traffic pinch point. I think that's a fact of the layout of the village, and wherever there's any developments, I think that this is always going to be a problem in the village. So we are dealing with a fact there, as far as I can see. It is, though, a village with a lot of connectivity, particularly with its rail line and its road links to across the county. So I do not object to developments per se on this site that we have in front of us here. I think it's something that, if done well, could improve and enhance the village. What I would say, though, is that there's a few issues, and a few of them on highways have been discussed already. I don't feel we have, in my view, an adequate solution, unless I can hear anything that will convince me in the forthcoming discussions, with regards to particularly the Marden Road High Street corner, if I've got my geography correct. And the second point I want to make because I know that traffic and highways will be talked about, is, and the parish council, I have to say, Mr. Chairman, we hear lots of parish councillors come, but I thought Councillor Burnham spoke incredibly well tonight and raised some very interesting points. And there was one he mentioned about the Jubilee Fields and the provision of open space. And I'd like to know from the officers how they expect residents, if this is built, to get to the Jubilee Fields, because that's actually a very good site. It's a very big site. I've been there often myself, and it's an asset to the village, but it is slightly on a limb. And I'd like to know, if I was a resident in this new development, how the officers would expect me to get to the Jubilee Fields, because I think that's an important point.
Members, I was trying not to impose a 3-minute speaking limit on members of the committee, but I'm afraid that if speeches are going to be of that length, I will have to. I'm sorry. With Mr. Fitzpatrick, would you please time them? There will be 3 minutes each speaker, because we cannot have speeches of that length and finish this meeting. I'm going to take Mr. Burton before you come back, otherwise we'll be coming back and forward all night.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll just say, first of all, really quickly, it's you're just lucky that I'm not actually sat next to my namesake tonight, because that usually does happen as well. I'd also like to say I probably wasn't going to mention it, but I do definitely agree with Councillor Borton on the issue of reams of urgent updates appearing before us. I know to some respect it may be avoidable, but it does make it difficult to make a well-informed decision when we are here. I'd like to address a couple of questions to Mr. Wright, because at the very beginning of when you spoke and towards the very end, there was mention of highways improvements that are available to us at this crossroads within the current highways boundary. And my question is concerning the option of compulsory purchase of some small portion of third-party land to enable not just plasters to be stuck on congested high streets, but highway solutions that actually have some longevity to them, and can take account of the safety considerations that have been raised by the parish council and others here tonight. Have such similar compulsory purchases been made elsewhere in the county? Has this been considered in this case? Has the developer been brought into those potential considerations so that they may discuss whether they would be willing to contribute towards longer-lasting highways resolutions?
Thank you, Chairman. This is a junction improvement that is required for the purposes of accommodating new development. The County Council would not enact a CPO process for a scheme that's required for development. I'm sure there are examples elsewhere in Kent where there have been highway schemes that the County Council itself has implemented for the benefit of the public at large, but this is specifically for development, so it falls into a different category.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wright. That's very clear. Was that all your questions, Councillor Burton? Thank you. Right, I will now bring back Mr. Bailey or Mr. Timms, whichever prefer.
Yeah, it was just very quickly on Councillor Bolton's access to Jubilee Fields. There is a pavement along the road to provide access to the fields, which are just to the southeast. In addition, there would be 2 new equipped play areas on the site, so there'd be on-site provision and there's easy access to Jubilee Fields.
Before we go on, I do need to make one point. There were a number of representations, including from Staplehurst Parish councillors and members of the public, on these applications, and a number of changes as a result of negotiations going on. We would not have been able to take those at all. And members of the planning committee have decided over the years as a committee, and it's not down to officers, we or your predecessors have decided that it is more important to actually have that flexibility and to allow the public to have their say than to have a cut-off point considerably earlier, which would needed if we were not going to have any urgent updates. Now, it is open to members of this council to review and this committee to review this, but it is not something officers have determined to do. Previous members made that decision for those reasons, and that needs to be clearly put on the record. Secondly, the councils have tried to talk. It isn't that they haven't, it's just they haven't agreed. There is a fundamental difference between not talking, not having discussions, and not reaching agreement. I think that does need to be mentioned. Councillor Powell.
Thank you, Chair. There's been some excellent talks here tonight, but there's also been some major issues that have been raised. And I was quite concerned, actually, when I listened to a colleague here tonight from the Parish Council, which was suggesting that perhaps this application is not quite ready, and has it really been brought before this committee too early? Is it being rushed through? Because there's so many different areas and so many discussions which are still ongoing, and we're being put into a position that we've got to A, predetermine through this committee tonight, and also additionally make a decision. I personally will find that very difficult. And I also feel that we're not giving enough time. There's 104 individual representations been made tonight, and these individual representations, if I'm just going to highlight just a few, highway safety, pedestrian safety and congestion, which we've talked about quite a bit tonight. I was extremely concerned by Mr. Wright from KCC when he was talking about safety is being compromised. Well, I'm afraid that is a decision I will never, ever give if safety is compromised. I know there's a bit of a spat there between NBC and KCC, but as far as I'm concerned, this is safety, and that is the issue. Rat running will occur in Hurst Close. Well, Hurst Close is an area which I actually know, and I can understand that. Poor access to village amenities, lack of parking at site and in village. The water drainage, as far as I am aware, that situation, which I can't comment, so I'm just observing tonight, has never actually been fully dealt with, which obviously leads to flooding, increased pollution. We've got a cumulative effect where we're talking about the south of Maidstone, a bit further down the road towards the Sutton Road. These are just observations, but I'm afraid that there's a lot of questions that still need to be raised. I totally agree with the Parish Council on this, that this application is being rushed through, and it shouldn't be.
Councillor Hastie, then I will bring the officer in and we will try and conclude get the debate.
Thank you. I just also want to say, I mean, I don't live in Staplehurst, so I'm particularly interested in the opinions of Councillor Bryce and the Parish Council. And the concerns about safety, I am very concerned about. You can't build all of these things without actually making proper provision for the people that are going to live there all through their life, the people in wheelchairs, elderly people with mobility scooters, parents with pushchairs, cyclists. They all need to be taken into consideration, because if one child gets hurt, that's one child too many, and I don't want that on my conscience. And that's... Thank you.
I'm going to ask Mr Bailey and Mr Timms to address some of these points, because I think some of the points the Parish Council raised are actually in the conditions, some may not be, and some of the points that members have raised are there. And I would like to ask you to address this issue of the highway safety and the mitigation, because I don't personally believe that that the mitigation is actually required on the cumulative impact figures, and it would be rather unwise to actually put in mitigation that isn't required, that is actually unsafe. So would you perhaps address that?
Yes, Clive. Just a couple of points that Councillor Powell's raised, and I'll obviously address the matter that the Chairman's raised as well. In terms of, I'll work backwards, in terms of poor access to the village, I think we have addressed that with Mr Timms with the access to the ground. In terms of the rat running, I'd just refer you to the urgent update report where we've looked at a mitigation scheme. We've asked for delegated powers in terms of to deal with the contribution. So we can get a rat running scheme, and they'd have to undertake surveys. So if that were to occur as a result of surveys, there would be a pot of money to mitigate the impacts of rat running. So there is a condition that deals with that, and there's a heads of terms on the urgent update that will try to address that particular issue. With regard to the issues, and I think this is where it really boils down to, is the safety issues. In terms of where we've got. I mean, obviously, in terms of what you've got in front of you, the local authority has been working for almost 2 years now on various options for the Staplehurst Junction. I have to be very honest, in terms of KCC Highways coming back with, new issues have been raised at the last minute. It's been an ongoing for almost 2 years, and I don't think that's been very constructive. But we are where we are, and we're moving forward. I think what you've got in front of you, members have options. They've got the officer recommendation with the mitigation. Now, that's all the development with the mitigation, and that's shown on the table 3. It is open to members, and it's not something I'm advocating, it is open to members that if they find that that mitigation creates a highway safety issue, it is open members tonight to determine that they don't have to have that mitigation. Now, I have to stand by the stance in terms of the officer recommendation, because that is the stance, by looking at the figures, that produces the minimum car queue lengths. Now, if members consider that the highway safety issue, as a result of the mitigation measures, i.e. the railings and i.e. the crossing points, are the key factors, it is open to them, and they will have the information in front of them, and that's shown on page 28, that the consequence of doing that would be increased queues. Now, those figures are clearly set out to them, and it is open to members if they decide that tonight. That's what they could do.
Right. Personally, I would say I'd rather have a small increase in the queue than a safety issue. I don't know about anyone else. Councillor Prendergast.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm not going to dwell on highways issues because my colleagues here have covered them quite well. But it's also the convenience of users on the highway network, and that does worry me. I just want to point out that that footway on Chestnut Avenue is less than 1 metre wide, so it really doesn't work for disabled users. I'm worried about disabled users on the crossing further down the high street on a sharp bend. I'm worried about our children on that bend. So really, I think we need to think through the impacts on the people who are using the roads, and they're serious in this instance. Thank you.
Councillor Prendergast. Councillor Burton, you come back because you didn't use all your previous...
Thank you, Chairman. I'll make it as brief as possible because I don't want my earlier comments being misconstrued. I am by no means suggesting that the determination of this application should depend on some kind of long-lasting highways solution. I actually think you've raised a fantastic point, Chairman, in saying that the additional cars that this will create is nothing compared to the safety concerns that we might have if the incorrect mitigation is put in place. I would like to, if I can, move an amendment. Can we
nothing
get? Are
has
we that
been
far
moved.
yet?
It will be a motion.
Well, I'll move a motion then. Yeah, no, hang on. I'm going to have to clarify. I'm going to have to get this clarified. So I'd like to move a motion to approve the application minus the mitigation measures, because I think the main concerns that are coming up here are to do with the safety issues.
We will check which condition of, part of the Section 106 agreement that is, and yeah. Yes, we're just that is the mitigation at the crossroads, not the buses and the trains and everything else. Obviously, we need to make that distinction. Obviously, right. I will second that motion, as I think that is the most sensible way forward. Just one moment. Yes, just to ensure that members know exactly what page we're on, literally, that is removing the financial heads of terms from the Section 106 agreement that refers to the junction improvements. And this does not mean that nothing will happen, because we have the previous overarching item of the petition and various other, so which relates to all three of those applications, but we removed the specific reference that you mentioned. Councillor Prendergast, obviously this is an important point. Feel free to clarify.
I just need to ask what will happen to the monies if they're not going into mitigation, because obviously there are other things that we could improve on. Surely it's a matter of negotiation.
Mr Bailey, I fear that, unfortunately, that might not be possible, but would you like to...
Yeah, I think Sorry. CL 122 regulations, in terms of they've got to be necessary direct related. So, you know, what we've got to have is a direct relation. There's a whole suite of mitigation measures that have come forward that have been CL 122 and 123 tested for compliance. Just because you drop that decision doesn't mean that you could use that money elsewhere, because there is a suite of other measures that, I mean, there's quite a considerable sum of contributions that you are seeking, and that's set out on pages 39 to 40. So it's not just a question of saying, well, let's use it elsewhere, because they've got to meet those three tests in order to be legally compliant.
I fear that is the legal situation, but it does still leave a very, very significant set of contributions there. But unfortunately, if you take something out, you can't just allot it elsewhere. Councillor Cox?
Is there no way we could just say we vary the mitigation at the junction to look more at safety between the junction and the named estate?
I fear, Councillor Cox, no, because we've spent 2 years trying to find a more acceptable solution, and it does not appear that there is one.
Yeah, I'd concur with that, Mr Chairman.
Members, it has been proposed by Councillor Burton, sorry, and seconded by myself that we approve the recommendation on the papers with the urgent update, but without the head of terms relating specifically and only to the junction improvements. Councillor Borton.
To absolutely clarify for certain then, so you are moving the recommendations on the paper with the exception of what, the third bullet point on page 40? That's correct. Okay.
Any further questions before we proceed, because it's quite important? Councillor Prendergast, you get the last word.
Is there any way we can just condition double yellow lines on the Headcorn Road element at the junction? At the moment, there are always cars parked there, and it just really holds the traffic up. There are single yellow lines. That would really help.
I'm sorry, I'm going to I'm going to end up with the last word. Members may remember the discussion at Harwich at the previous meeting. What we can do, because double yellow lines or single yellow lines are effectively something that can either be launched by the county council or our own, is actually make a recommendation either to strategic planning or to the Joint Transportation Board that be done, but it would have to be a separate resolution.
I mean, I would endorse that. It's what members did at the last planning committee. If you'll remember, it could be a second resolution to endorse a recommendation up to the committee to say that you'd like them to look at that particular junction with particular specifics relating to yellow lining, and they could look at that. I think that's a good recommendation.
So to be clear, that will be a separate vote afterwards. Okay. When we get to that, Councillor Cox. Right, those in favour of the motion that has been proposed and seconded. Those against? Abstentions? Thank you very much. Right, that is not... Okay, thank you very much. Now we move on to the second resolution that Councillor Prendergast suggested and proposed. And Councillor Cox, I understand you are wishing to second that. Do you wish to speak to it?
I reserve my right.
In that case, I will put it to the vote that we recommend to Strategic Planning Committee and to the Joint Transport Board, should it prove necessary, that a traffic regulation order be examined for the junction. Did you refer specifically to the Headcorn Road? In particular, the Headcorn Road? To the east of the crossroads. That correct? Right. All those in favour? Right. That's everyone. So I don't need... Right, members, we will have a short 10-minute break.